ただいまより
We would like to start the Roppongi Hills 10th Anniversary Global Conference Innovative City Forum's Mori Art Museum Session 3 and closing session. This forum is held commemorating the 10th anniversary of Roppongi Hills. Sponsored by Mori Memorial Fund, Mori Art Museum, and Academy Hills. The theme is designing the future for global cities and lifestyles. We have been going through a global conference for the 3 days with our global opinion leaders in the realm of the leading edge technology, culture, creative, and urban development. And this is our last program. This would be the Mori Art Museum Session 3 and the closing session. First, we would go through the Mori Art Museum Session 3 under the theme of creative cities and a life in future. We would like to introduce our speakers for this session. We have Mr. Lowry. Mr. Lowry became the 6th director of a Museum of Modern Art in New York in 1995, and he is leading 760 staffs at the moment, so that he will be able to lead various programs, including exhibition, acquiring, and publications. And he is also a member of the Mori Art Museum International Advisory Committee member. Next, we have Nicholas Serota. Mr. Nicholas Serota has worked at the Whitechapel Art Gallery, Oxford's Museum of Modern Art, and after that he has become the director of Tate in 1988. Since then, Tate has been able to open Tate St. Ives in 1993 and Tate Modern in 2000, and Tate has also gone through the renovation of the building in Millbank, and which came to become the Tate Britain. Mr. Joichi Ito. Mr. Ito is the director of MIT Media Lab. He is also on the board for Sony Corporations and other organizations and companies. And in 2008, he has been named as the 25 most influential people on the web by the Business Week in 2008. And also in 2011, he has been selected as the top 100 global thinkers by the Foreign Policy. Mr. Kiyoshi Kurokawa. Mr. Kiyoshi Kurokawa is the academic fellow of the National Graduate Institute for Policy Studies. He is also an MD, and he has also been working at the UCLA School of Medicine, University of Tokyo, and the Tokai University School of Medicine Dean. He is also on the International Council of Science Council of Japan, and he is also the member of the Committee of Science and Technology and the Policy of Government. He is also a science advisor to the cabinet, and he is also chair of the Fukushima Nuclear Accident Independent Investigation Commission of National Diet. And we have Mori Art Museum Director Fumio Nanjo as the moderator for this session. Now, we would like to start the global conference commemorating the 10th anniversary of the Roppongi Hills, and this is going to be the Innovative City Forum Session 3, Mori Art Museum Session 3. So I would like to start the Innovative City Forum Mori Art Museum Session 3. This started 2 days ago. There has been many topics covered by numerous disciplines. The heart of this forum is that there will be interdisciplinary participants that will be able to exchange numerous opinions. So the Mori Art Museum Session 1 and 2 relatively had the expert in the art arena. In the Mori Art Museum Session 3, we would go over and beyond. We would be participating numerous panelists from the different disciplines and go through the panel discussions. The theme of the Innovative City Forum is about the design of the city and the creative industries and the art, architecture and technology and the other softwares and others. And so we would first like to be able to start off this session by talking about urban development and city. And that's why we decided we would like to start by talking about the creative cities and the like. So first of all, we would like to invite Mr. Glenn Lowry. He is the director of MoMA. And his profile is included in the program, so I will not be repeating myself. MoMA has developed tremendously over the couple of years. It's been extended, and it stands as MoMA today. So I hope that he will be able to hear about what the museum should be in these modern days. So now, Mr. Glenn Lowry.
Thank you so much, Fumio, and it's a pleasure to be here, especially on the 10th anniversary of the Mori Art Museum, to think a little bit about the way in which museums animate, activate, and make viable our cities. And Fumio asked me to speak a little bit about the way in which the Museum of Modern Art over the last decade has expanded. And I took that to mean not just within the city, but as an institution and as an idea around the world. But let me begin by simply locating the museum, because the Museum of Modern Art is fundamentally an urban institution. It's located just to the south of Central Park and in one of the most dense environments in the world, in the center of Midtown Manhattan. And it literally is nestled into the street, surrounded by skyscrapers and other buildings. And it is this aspect of the museum, its kind of urban centrality, that gave rise to the institution as a very particular kind of place. Because if you think about most museums, especially in the 1920s when the Museum of Modern Art was founded, at least in North America, they were often located in the middle of a park or a garden. They were set apart from the city up a flight of stairs. If you've ever been to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, you'll know what I mean. The founders of the Museum of Modern Art, however, thought of it as a place that was grounded on the street, that drew its energy, its livelihood, and its meaning from its relationship to the city as an urban space. And this idea of the museum rooted in the street, rooted in the city, is precisely what Yoshio Taniguchi who took as his point of departure a decade ago when he redesigned the museum and expanded it, because his notion was to take that street and extend it within the institution, to make the institution, if you wish, a mirror of its urban environment. And this is reflected not only in the way in which people circulate and navigate within the institution, but also in the idea that at the heart of the museum was a central atrium or gathering place that could, in its own way, mirror Central Park as a place that you went to take a moment to breathe in the middle of the urban environment, to take a moment to reflect, to be with friends, and to relax. So that he saw the museum as not only a place of energy, but also a place of gathering, and ultimately as a place of repose. And here, the garden in the museum becomes the moment where you can suddenly slow down. And I think that is an essential aspect of what museums can do within cities. They can provide an awful lot of energy, but they can also provide a space in which to think, reflect, and decelerate. As we've tried to understand our role in the city, we've also recognized that we're a private institution, and one of our realities is we have to charge admission, which is not something that makes it easy for us to engage the largest possible audience. So what we have done recently is to turn our garden into a free space where anyone from the city of New York can just simply come before we're open, relax, enjoy a moment with sculpture, and in this way lets the museum seep out from inside its own space. Now, the Museum of Modern Art is many different places. It is an institution on 53rd Street in Midtown Manhattan. It is also MoMA PS1, a center for contemporary art on the opposite side of the East River, about 2.5 miles from Midtown Manhattan. And this is very important because MoMA PS1 is a very different place. It allows a very different audience to engage with the museum. If Manhattan is this dense urban environment, Long Island City and Queens are much more spread out, and demographics are fundamentally different. Where the Museum of Modern Art has a huge international audience, MoMA PS1 has a more local audience. Where the Museum of Modern Art's audience tends to be 40 or 50 years old, MoMA PS1's audience tends to be 25 years old and is rooted in the outer boroughs, Brooklyn and Queens and Staten Island. And this allows the museum to play a dual role within the city, engaging not one borough but two boroughs in a kind of dynamic. And I always admire the way you look back on Manhattan from MoMA PS1, recognizing that New York is a much more complicated place than a single borough. Now, one of the things that we're able to do out in Long Island City is to actually build architecture, because one of our responsibilities is architecture, along with painting and sculpture and photography and film and media. And so every summer we build a temporary structure that becomes a site of a music festival. And that music festival allows us to bring literally thousands of young people together to experience new music, architecture, and the city in a different way. And what we realized is this provided an opportunity for us to think about the museum not only as a place where you look at art in a traditional sense, but also as a place where you can think about art in very different ways. And this led us to start imagining the museum as a partner with other institutions around the world. And we've taken the Young Architects program, we call it YAP for short, and extended that now to Rome with the Museum of the 21st Century. And every year we run a joint competition with the Museum for the 21st Century, as well as Santiago, Chile, where we work with Constructo, and most recently in Istanbul with the Istanbul Modern. So now the idea of the Museum of Modern Art and its programs has to be seen as part of multiple cities. And I think this is very important because there's a tendency when we think of the city to think of it as a single location in a particular latitude and longitudinal axis. But in the global world, cities are all interconnected to each other through digital media as well as more physical means. And through these partnerships, what we're really doing is knitting together a number of different urban centers in a shared conversation and dialogue. Something that we also are doing with shared programs that we are developing on bilateral bases with institutions like the Art Gallery of Western Australia and many others, where we can share our collections and expertise and where we can learn from other institutions about their knowledge, and thus continuing to build the idea of the museum as an aggregator of information, possibilities, and ideas. If you extend that now through a whole range of educational initiatives like massive online courses or MOOCs, what we've learned is that the museum can become a hub for a whole set of activities that can reach a much different and much broader audience than we ever imagined. We launched our first MOOC this summer, and it was an online course for teachers, and we had 17,000 participants that stayed throughout the entire course, from 66% of which were from outside the United States. And much more importantly, you begin to see on a map like this that we touch over 100 countries. So a single place can radiate out and connect literally dozens and multiple dozens of places to each other. And what fascinates me is not the idea of a center with spokes, but rather a kind of open network that is constantly reconstituting itself each time a new institution or a new place joins and reconfigures all of the pre-existing relationships. Now, if the museum is a physical place in Manhattan and a physical place in Long Island City and a series of programs that radiate around the world, it is also a digital space, and it exists online. And I think most museums have learned that their online audience is as important as their physical audience. But what's interesting about an online audience is its growth is exponential and infinite, whereas physical audiences are limited by space. And more importantly, I think we've all evolved to realizing that what we do online does not have to be identical to what we do in space. And thus, we can take the idea of the museum and continue to expand it and engage it. And in this context, we launched recently something called Audio Plus, which is a way of imagining the museum in your hand. It's not simply an audio guide that lets you learn about the museum. It's also a handheld social networking device that lets you connect to everybody else in the museum who's on this device at the same time, and to share ideas, to start conversations, to organize, to meet in an individual space, to even take photographs and share them with each other. In the first 5 weeks of launching this, 500,000 photographs have been shared among users here. And what that tells me is that there is a community that is hungry to connect to each other within the city about art. And that community can begin the conversation within the museum, but it can also extend it outside the museum into an ongoing loop. And if you just look at the impact of social media in the context of the museum, you can immediately see the numbers of people who are using social networks to talk to each other about experiences in the museum. And this is an integral part of the city as well, because the city has to understand itself both as a physical and metaphorical place. And that's what's taking place in these conversations online. When you add it all together, a place that, if it were limited only to those who walked in the door, might draw 3 million people a year, actually has a worldwide audience of some 41 million people a year. That is, if you add in all the people who come on site, who see our programs off-site, who connect online through social media, and who share our educational initiatives, you begin to understand that the scope of our institution, like the scope of many other institutions, is larger than the entire population of the city of New York. This radiation, if you want to look at it that way, of the impact of what we do, I think highlights how powerful museums are within the social fabric of their cities. There are very few other kinds of institutions that can touch this many people so consistently and bind them together in a shared conversation about art. Now, if this has been about the way the museum has connected outward, I want to also talk for a moment about how the museum has endeavored to change its relationship to the city. We began a whole series of experiments to take the museum in a way outside its own walls, to make it woven into the way in which people experience New York. This is a project called Sleepwalkers by Doug Aiken that we did several years ago, where Doug turned the entire exterior of the museum into a cinematic multiplex that told a kind of story about 5 different New Yorkers and their imagined existence. But what it really did was to provide anyone who was wandering down the streets at night the opportunity to see something new and different, and to stop for a moment and to think about their city and how it operated. In a similar vein, this summer we presented Rain Room, which we took over an empty lot near the museum and did this project with Random International, a Berlin-based group, that imagined what it would be like to be in the middle of a thunderstorm with the rain pouring down on you and you being the only person who remained dry. And this was a little bit of magic. It was the idea, and it was a project that started in London and no doubt will travel elsewhere in the world, but it drew literally hundreds of thousands of people to think about an experience in their city that would have been impossible to present inside the museum. A, because of the amount of space required, but B, because of the amount of water that was circulating, and that would have been an extraordinarily difficult challenge. So we were able to take a project and weave it into the fabric of the city, and by doing that, allow New Yorkers to think about their city in a different way. Or more specifically, to engage our public in the very act of being a citizen within the institution. And this is a project by Roman Undak called Measuring Your Universe, in which anyone who walked into a room could have their height inscribed on a wall and their initials. And so you begin this project by one or two people coming into a room, and then each being noted for the day and the height, the day they came in their height, and eventually you begin to have a wall that marks all of the various people who came into the museum, until ultimately you have this extraordinary kind of vortex reflecting each person. But what's important about this project is that it allows a group of people who would otherwise be anonymous to be inscribed into the institution as individuals. And by doing that, it lets people who use the museum take ownership of the museum. Now they're as much a part of the institution as any work of art on the wall. And this ability of the institution, in a way, to grab hold of a public and frame it and embed it into the museum is a way of taking the kind of large anonymity of what it's like to walk through the city on a street where you go by hundreds of people, and suddenly have each one of those memorialized within the institution. And I want to conclude by suggesting that what museums can do better than almost any institution I know for a city is be a home for the multitude, a place where literally tens of thousands of people a day can find something interesting, can connect to each other and to art, can feel a part of the fabric of the city, but at the same time be a place where a single person can find a unique experience and literally jump for joy. And when museums can fulfill these two different roles between the large and the small, the individual and the mass, the particular and the general, then they become like catalytic engines that can drive the cultural and intellectual life of the city. And I always like this image that Yoshio created for us of the museum, where it is exploding out of its walls, where its energy becomes the energy of the street, and where the street itself becomes the energy of the museum. It's in this way that a place like the Museum of Modern Art is an inherently urban institution and part of the larger intellectual life of the city. Thank you very much.
That was a very energetic presentation. Feels you really rewarding to be involved in museum. Museums are expected to play various different roles, which are quite different from the expectations that people had of museums in the past. Integration with the city, to go beyond, to break the walls. I think that is the requirement of time. A different practice, expanding, changing city from Tate Modern and others. I'd like to invite Sir Nicholas Serota, please.
Thank you. Fumio, ladies and gentlemen, like Glenn, it's a pleasure to be here on an occasion when you celebrate not only the 10th anniversary of the Mori Museum, but obviously also the 10th anniversary of Roppongi Hills, an incredible vision created by Minoru Mori, inspired, of course, by his love of Le Corbusier, but already a treasured place within the city of Tokyo. Sadly, I was not here this morning. I came from London, having had to be in London until late last night for the Frieze Art Fair and meetings of our International Council. But I want to pick up from where some of the points that have just been raised by Glenn, and to remind you that Tate Modern is only now 13 years old. It comes in a long history and tradition of museums. Museums, of course, have always been centers of learning, research, and display, and they've also equally had a very strong civic role. But that civic role, I think, has changed quite dramatically in the last 20 or 30 years, as Glenn has just been reminding us. That acceleration really began in the 60s, both in terms of the numbers of visitors and the kind of experience that they were seeking. It went further, of course, with the creation of an institution like the Pompidou Center in Paris, and in particular the way in which that knits into the city. And of course, Bilbao Guggenheim opening in the late 90s was itself not just an explosion in Spain, but obviously set a pattern and has been much admired and indeed copied across the world. When Tate Modern opened in 2000, the ambition, of course, was to create for the first time a proper museum of modern art in London, but also to create a new museum in a new part of London, a part of London that had been previously neglected, unbelievably neglected given its central location within the city, and also to create a new kind of space within the museum. And here you see the Turbine Hall, an image that most of you will know very well. This simply reminds us that we are right in the heart of the city, Tate Modern, opposite to St. Paul's Cathedral, surrounded by a number of other cultural institutions, as you see from this plan, right on the river itself, but in a part of London which had previously been very much neglected. That is Tate Modern 25 years ago. And you see a number of things. First of all, an industrial site, but also an industrial site surrounded not by a grid pattern of small streets, but almost working on an industrial scale with large blocks, office blocks, and the whole fabric of the city very much broken by this introduction of massive elements within the fabric, mainly in the late 19th century and obviously through into the mid-20th century. That's a reminder that it's not that far from Bankside across the river to the city, the center of wealth in London, the center of wealth in London, and also a place with which we had to make a connection at a very early stage. But this is the space that has in a way defined Tate Modern in one element of its work. That is to say, a space in which artists can make installations. Here, Olafur Eliasson 10 years ago in 2003, or Carsten Höller in 2006. Both of these immersive installations, both of them, as have been many of the other installations in this space, very much about the engagement of the individual with the work of art, but also a social experience, and one which, as Glenn has also been saying, I'm sure we'll come back to this in the discussion, one in which individuals create their own identity and also seek out conversations and indeed exchange with others. Over the past 10 years, Tate Modern has encouraged us to think, the growth of Tate Modern and the growth of audiences at Tate Modern has encouraged us to think about a number of different changes that are required within the building. And as many of you will be aware, we are in the process now of building an extension. The pressures on us in terms of numbers, we receive more than 5 million visitors a year. The demands from our audience in terms of thinking about the kinds of conversations they want to have both with artists and with each other. The development of the internet and the opportunities that that creates for us have encouraged us to think about new kinds of spaces in the museum. And as we move forward, we have begun on the process of building this extension. A part opened last year for a year. These are the tank spaces, formerly the oil tanks for the power station, now converted into spaces for installation, performance, conversation, dialogue, discussion, conferences. The most successful event that we held last summer was a conference and festival held over a 2-week period organized by young people aged between 16 and 24, called Undercurrents, in which they invited artists and performers to use these spaces in all kinds of different ways. And it's that which has driven us forward also in thinking about the way in which we will use the museum and develop the museum in the future. Here you see a slide of Charles Atlas performing in the space a work made in homage to Merce Cunningham. Merce Cunningham, of course, choreographer and leader of the dance company that of fundamental importance in the post-1960s period onwards, who had already performed in the Turbine Hall, and this piece in the tanks was a certain homage to Cunningham, again, another element of the Charles Atlas performance. In thinking about the extension to Tate Modern, I had to take you back 10 years. In 2001-2, having created Tate Modern, and you see it at the center of the left-hand part of this slide, that gray rectangle in the city, opposite to St. Paul's Cathedral, connected by the bridge, which we had caused to be built, not directly as part of the project, but as an addition, we became conscious that it was very much landlocked, looking out onto the river, but not connecting to the other parts of the city. And we commissioned Richard Rogers and Partners to do a study of the means of communication through the southern part of the city to the south of Tate Modern, running down to a very neglected part of London, the Elephant and Castle. And here you see the plan that they made, suggesting that links could be enormously strengthened by a relatively small number of interventions. At the same time, we looked very carefully, and I'm getting really into some detail on urban planning here because I think it's suggestive of the way in which museums can influence cities very directly. You see there a determination that we should establish or indeed re-establish links to the south from Tate Modern, connecting through onto the main thoroughfares and the main points of circulation. In that plan, you'll see to the south of Tate Modern, a series of buildings that were there in 2001 and are no longer there. And when we came to discuss what should replace them, not Tate buildings, but other people's buildings, we managed to persuade the planning authorities that they should make a break exactly where that double-headed arrow occurs. These are the two parts of the city: the rich, successful City of London and the poor Bankside, Southwark on the south. And in 2003, we invited a practice Witherford Watson Mann to consider some proposals that developed on the Rogers study with a view to making the improvements I was touching on earlier to this area to the south. And Witherford Watson Mann came up with the notion of the Bankside urban forest. Their plan was to take some of those existing routes, the viaducts that run beneath the railways, the small streets, the small elements of urban fabric that are undeveloped and not built on, and to see whether they could improve the whole context for living in that part of London by a number of small-scale interventions. Here you see a very run-down cafe on a very tight site close to one of these railway viaducts. And here you see the intervention made by Witherford Watson Mann to turn this into a more public space that can work at different times of the year in different weathers. Here, not bright sun, but at least some sun. Another kind of intervention is the greening of the city in a very small plot to build and to create a little orchard, or in this small piece of land on the edge of the pavement close to Tate Modern with Ivan and Heather Morrison, we've created, simply by building this screen, a wall, a space, an enclave where events and other activities can take place. New buildings come immediately around us. Here, building by Richard Rogers and Partners, changing the scale of the landscape, changing the scale of the space, giving it a human scale and a human quality by planting, by ensuring that there are small-scale developments such as shops and cafes at ground level, even if there are private residential apartments above. And here, very quickly, an aerial view of Tate Modern and the plans for the redevelopment and extension of the building. You see to the left these four lozenge-shaped buildings that are the Rogers Towers. You see Tate Modern, you see the turbine hall with its glass roof, and then to the southwest, the new extension rising above those oil tanks. You see just beside them these circular shapes, which are the vestigial elements of the oil tanks as they come above. And this is an image taken 10 days ago of the building as it's rising, a pyramid around the central core, which will provide galleries, social spaces, and crucially below the oil tank spaces for performance. Again, Aldo Tambolini, a film program in the tanks using these spaces, making it possible for the Tate to engage with the way in which artists are developing their ideas about working across disciplines, working with other disciplines within the creative industries, beginning to think more, not just in terms of the static, but also the moving. And here, Anna Teresa de Keersmacher, the first performance in the oil tanks, the recapitulation of a work that had been made 20 years ago, performed for a new generation. Again, a reinterpretation, if you like, of what a museum can do. It isn't simply about preserving a work of art as an object which sits on a wall. It is also about the research that is required to reenact a very important and seminal work that sits within the area which is performance, dance, visual art. Increasingly, we find ourselves covering all these disciplines rather than simply the static visual. And it is that interconnection with the creative industries. It's that way of working with individuals, but also placing them in society. It is about making it possible for people to communicate with one another. Glenn mentioned the MOOCs that MoMA have been working with. We, for the last 5 years, have been developing through the internet a whole range of programs with schools across the world. We provide a program which builds on the experience of the turbine hall and reaches 40,000 young people every week in schools across, I think it's 19 countries in the world. This is exactly the kind of way in which a museum of modern art is bound to work, I think, in the 21st century. And I look forward to discussing these and other points in the panel discussion that follows. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I remember when Tate Modern was established. Back then, it was in a city, but it was something that was forgotten. But the area has changed dramatically. And the museum had a big impact to urban development efforts. And now we would like to invite our third speaker, Mr. Joichi from MIT Media Lab. He's the director of the MIT Media Lab. In the Innovative City Forum, he was present at the Technology, Design, Science, Art, and how we will be able to have an interdisciplinary session. He was a moderator for that session on the afternoon of the first day in this forum. And today he will be the speaker. And now, Mr. Ito, please.
So I'll speak in English because I think as part of the panel it will work better. So this is the Media Lab building. It was designed by Fumihiko Maki, and it's so Cambridge, where we live, is not innovative probably in the same way that London and New York are, but it has its own version of being very innovative. And I think one of the keys to the ecosystem of Cambridge and then more closely around MIT is the relationship between the academics, the fact that we have Harvard and MIT within walking distance, and that everything, almost everything you can find within walking distance, and it's a small kind of microcosm. So I think a lot about the school and the institution, as well as how do we encourage innovation and create an innovative city. Inside of the Media Lab, it looks kind of like this. And so when we were, when they were designing this with Maki-san, they were trying to create a space that encouraged collaboration. So this is a space that has 3 different labs. And as you can see, it's all about making things and building things. So it's, in some ways it resembles a museum because people walk through the labs and see all kinds of things, but it's also very much a living lab. But these buildings in the institution of MIT, even though I think is very innovative, I think there are some changes that we need to think about. So I often use this metaphor. I'm an internet guy, so I still remember the world before internet, BI, when life was simple. Things were predictable. There were a lot of rules that you could follow. Economists were mostly could predict things. And what happens after internet is the world becomes extremely complex, it becomes unpredictable, and it becomes hyperconnected. And my personal opinion is that there are some similarities in the world from before internet and after internet, but eventually there are fundamental changes that happen to just about everything in the world. And when we think about it, I think that this internet thing is an evolutionary step where we're going kind of into the next phase. But when you think about evolution, you kind of think about this sort of designed, orderly process, maybe like this artist's image of us taking off. But I think it's actually much more like a natural system. I think that when you think about this massively complex thing that looks like chaos if you don't really understand it, it actually looks a lot more like nature than it does like some sort of orderly engineered process. And I think what's really important as we start to think about science and technology, which is one of the key things that we work on at the lab, is how to redesign the way that we think about science and technology. So science and technology historically has been to try to make life more efficient, more controlled. It was often an attempt to control nature. So what you would do is you would control nature to try to get local gain, to try to make more money, to have more energy. And the idea was kind of really feasting on nature at nature's expense for our benefit. It turns out we got really good at this and we were destroying nature. And so even a lot of art, some of the beautiful gardens that I see, even the Japanese bonsai as well as the European manicure gardens, it's really kind of a triumph over nature. Look what we made nature do. But I think that that attitude in science and technology will destroy us. And so one of the fundamental shifts that I think we're doing at the Media Lab and other places, Neri's work is a very good example of this, is really trying to become part of nature, learning from nature, and designing with nature rather than trying to design over nature. So that's, I think, a really important sort of design principle. The other thing that's happening is that these kids are now using the internet. So I still remember when there was no internet, but these kids don't remember that. And I think that there's a fundamentally different brain that's being created inside of these kids' heads. They have a different cognitive model. And so we are designing a world, cities, for kids whose minds we don't understand. And so I think we also have to create a process that allows us to be flexible enough so that when the kids get there, they feel comfortable as well. This is the way that education works still. And even MOOCs, while they're great, still is kind of based on this model, that there's some important person that everybody focuses on and you receive information and knowledge. And the idea that you would study, I mean, I often think about courses in schools as kind of like reading the encyclopedia from end to end before you get to do anything. You know, that in the world of the internet, you can get the information as you need it. You can search for things. You can ask people things. You're never going to be on the top of a mountain by yourself with a test and a number 2 pencil. You'll always have your network with you. So how do you redesign a world which is not about linear learning? So this is a sensor that we've designed at the lab that measures your galvanic skin response, which is basically the conductivity of your skin. And it tells you roughly your neurological activity. So we had an MIT student wear it for a week, and this is what it looks like. So if you look here, this is when they're in the lab, there's a little bit of activity, not too much activity when they're watching TV, Sleep, it turns out, there is activity because you see dreams and things. And then relaxing, studying, it's a lot of activity because you're using your brain. Sleep, again, class flat, class flat, class flat, class flat. In fact, classes are flatter than when you're sleeping. So if this is some indication of how these young people enjoy the lectures, or how much neural activity is occurring, because you kind of have to have neural activity to actually learn. That's probably a pretty decent guess. And so we have data to show that. I think that we need to think about the educational system as well. The other thing I think that's really important when we think about innovation is about creativity. And in the post-industrial, organized, mass-produced world, you didn't really want a whole bunch of people being creative when they're making widgets or painting cars. But in an information world where machines are taking over most of the repetitive tasks and human beings are being forced to be innovative, you want more and more society to behave in a creative way. And our educational system is really rewarding people who do predictable things in an organized way and do give you the same answer no matter who you ask. But what you really want is you want creativity, which is that everyone gives you different answers and they all question and things like that. So I think that in a creative society, an innovative society, these two things are connected, and I think we forget that when we design education. And so I think you have to think about the mind in a completely new way, because I think that we really have been focused on trying to make the mind behave more like a computer or behave more like a robot. When we have robots and computers now, we have to redesign the way we think about the mind. This is a wonderful sketch by Rich Gold, who was actually an interesting person because he had many hats. He was an artist, he was a scientist, he was a designer, he was an engineer. And this is an interesting matrix because, and this ties to a lot of the other things. So designers tend to look at, so for instance, if you have a designer, they try to figure out what the audience wants and then produce it. So if I were a designer and you said, oh, can you change that green to match the color of my sofa so it fits my room better? A designer would love that feedback. Artists probably wouldn't. Artists tend to be looking at nature or looking at within for some sort of truth. It's very similar, by the way, to scientists. So when a scientist is going after a new subatomic particle, that scientist isn't thinking at that moment about exactly how this is going to change the way he lives his life. But there is some sort of peering into the truth and this pursuit of beauty. And it's interesting because the designers and the engineers are kind of similar. Engineers try to get real-world constraints and create things that have utility, things that have function. And so in a funny way, designers and engineers tend to get along better than designers and artists and scientists and engineers. But for anybody who saw Neri's presentation, I think what's important is that actually one person can do all of these things. And I think the key is to be able to do all of them. So interdisciplinary is when you have 4 people and they're talking to each other. Anti-disciplinary is what we call ourselves, is when you have one person doing all of them. Now, you can argue whether you can be an artist while you're being a designer or not. But the idea that you can do all of them is actually very important, because I think science inspires engineering, art inspires design, and the designer is one way, at least, for art to impact a city or to impact the real world is through this translation between artist and designer and scientist and engineer. So this is just kind of an interesting thing. When I post this on the internet, there are a lot of people get upset because, well, what about what about history, or what about, so this is the way I look at the world, though. These are some principles of after internet that I like to talk about, and I won't go through all of them, but this notion of pull over push, this means that instead of stocking all this information and power centrally and pushing it out, which is a way you would do traditional command and control, you pull it from the network as you need it. You don't learn things, because you can learn just about anything on the internet when you want it now, and so you don't actually have to memorize everything beforehand. You can find a YouTube video to learn just about anything. And so the idea is actually it makes you a lot more flexible and agile if you're not carrying a lot of things. The typical, and this is, I would love to talk more about museums too, because the problem is when you stock a bunch of stuff, you get very heavy. And whether it's lines of code or lots of employees, it makes it very difficult for you to change course. And now cities, it's tricky because cities are about stuff. And I think what's interesting is to think about what is the equivalent for cities for that. Compass over maps is, I like to think about it's important to have a general trajectory, But when you get there, the complexity of the world today makes it very, very difficult to know exactly what's going to happen. And so I gave this example at the previous session, but I had a company that was trying to raise money, and the investors spent more money deciding not to do it on the feasibility study than they did on the investment. So when the cost of thinking about something or the cost of planning something actually exceeds the cost of trying, then that doesn't make sense anymore. And I think one of the key things with the internet, with software, and now with digital fabrication and other types of technology, the cost of trying things has gotten so low that often it doesn't pay to make maps. Again, practice over theory is another one which I really like. We do this at the labs. Some of my faculty don't like this because some of them are very theoretical, but the idea is that don't let the lack of theory stop you from trying something. And often when you try something, you will learn something that you wouldn't have been able to theorize. And so thinking about, I'm on the board of two foundations, the Knight Foundation and the MacArthur Foundation. We actually give money to libraries and museums. And one of the things I push our program officers quite a bit on is don't come up with metrics. Don't measure book circulation in the library as one-way measure of success because you're constraining them. Give them the money, let them do whatever they want to do, figure out if it's interesting, and then come up with the metrics. And I think that it's important to have theory, but I think it's important not to allow the lack of theory to prevent you from practice. Disobedience over compliance is also, you don't win Nobel Prizes by doing what you're told. And I think it's interesting because all of the very, interesting people we have at the conference are very disobedient people who probably always questioning authority, but then they expect the people who work for them to be very obedient. And I think that's kind of a problem. And then learning over education, because we're an educational institution, I would say, education to me is what people do to you. And learning is what you do to yourself. And we have a group called Lifelong Kindergarten, which is kindergarten is when everybody's playing and learning because they're passionate. And as you get into grade school, you stop being allowed to have so much fun, and life gets organized, life gets less creative. There's a great book by the Kelly brothers about creative confidence. And this kid who's 7 years old, he pulls a piece of clay out of a bucket and starts making a horse, and another kid looks over the shoulder and says, "What an ugly horse." And he throws the clay back into the bucket and never touches it again. And I think school is so much about destroying creative confidence, and we actually have to actively generate creative confidence. And I think that a lot of this has to do with the notion of education being really trying to organize people rather than promote creativity. So I'll finish with a couple of images. These are images from the movie Minority Report. One of our graduates, John Underkoffer, was one of the main advisors on the technology and the displays and things like this. It's kind of interesting because this movie was created over 10 years ago, and Steven Spielberg made them make the whole world so that he could go in there and point the camera anywhere and shoot the shot. So they had to design all the technology and the underlying thinking behind it. And this is supposed to be set in 2054. Well, half the stuff already works now. And so I think one other thing that's really important to think about as we think about the future, I think one of our homework assignments was to think 20 years from now, is that it takes longer, sometimes it takes a little longer than you expect in the short term. But when you look in the long term, technology tends to come faster than we expected. And so I think that we really need to be thinking very aggressively in this kind of science fiction-y way about cities in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It was talking about a different world connected onto the internet. It covered numerous aspects. So next, we would have Mr. Kurokawa sensei. He used to be a professor of the Medical Institute and MD, and he was also leading the efforts in order to go through the Fukushima's power plant. And so he has a lot of direct opinions for this, and he has been in the limelight because of his chair of Fukushima's nuclear accident independent investigation. So not only does his knowledge cover the medicines, but it covers a lot of different areas as well.
Thank you for inviting me for this opportunity. I am completely out of box compared to these three very prominent speakers and with a career. But I think I'd like to share with you some of the aspects, I think, of the city and future. And also in this outline, we supposed to sort of project maybe 20 years from now. But to do that, maybe perhaps we might look back what happened 20 years earlier. And that's a time when Cold War ended. And that's early 1990s. I think Japan went bubble burst. And all of a sudden, World Wide Web came into the sort of marketplace in 1991. At the same time, Cold War ended. That means Soviet Union disappeared. And that is sort of beginning of globalization. And now eBay and Yahoo and Amazon all came in 1993 or 94. So that was the time. But technology always advanced very fast. Whatever, technologist is always working on their own technology. Consequence, who cares? Humans are not so much adaptive to such a rapid change. So see what happened in the recent years. Now the first slide, first one. This is the third or no? Is this the first one? All right, now you begin to see everybody just doing this thing. I may not be listening to me, but I think that's the way we do. So every 30 minutes or 1 hour, you have to check your text message or this thing, and that's really technology change your behavior. And this happens, so even in this metro, on this train in Japan, just nobody speaks and everybody very quiet. And so that's what happens. And in fact, if you think about when this iPad came or iPhone came, that's only 7 years ago. And that really changed your behavior, a touching thing. And the iPad came only 3 years ago. That changed a lot of behavior for every one of you. And that's also changing the business model and the way you think. Next slide. Oh, I had to do it. Oh, okay. So now I think everybody is connected, and this is what's happening in Japan. Nobody speaks, and nobody's just looking at each other, and nobody sees any expression, no dialogue, and that's it. So that at the end, I think you're sort of evolving to a long time, but all of a sudden you're connected into your gadget, and you are not talking to anyone, but you have to respond to that person who was connecting through net. But you never saw them. No dialogue, no facial expression, which has been very unique to humans. And we speak each other. And with some movement of your body and facial expression, you like me, or I like you, this or that, but somehow you're connected. And because of this connectivity, you may send many emails by CC, and many CCs, when you receive it, somehow you are urged to respond, otherwise you become left alone, right? So that means your depths of your thinking in response is become very shallow and very short, but you're forced to respond. Otherwise, those who send you email or something, text mail, why not responding to me? And even this many countries, the young girls or just boys and the youngsters are much in trouble. They are buried in this thing and just even commit suicide in a few days ago. That's the way we have been working now. So I think technology always advances. Don't worry, just they do, regardless of you like it or not. So that's what it is. So singularity will coming very soon. According to some of the literature, I think singularity, what's happening, countdown to singularity, this is the year of years. So from left, life emerges on the planet Earth, eukaryotic cell, this is not human yet, Cambrian explosion to primate and superfamily, hominid and family, and then human ancestor, walk and spoken language, Homo sapiens, about maybe 100,000 years ago. And then this logarithmic space, Homo sapiens sapiens came, 100,000 years of art, early cities, some cluster of people, and then agriculture 10,000 years ago. All of a sudden, we don't need to worry about something to eat tomorrow, but in 1 month ahead. And then agriculture came, and all of a sudden, a few thousand years later, like civilization emerged somewhere. That is the sort of origin of the city we are talking about. We heard about London and New York, and also we are in Tokyo. This is a sort of vision by Minoru Mori-san, which really started in materialize 10 years ago. And that, of course, embrace museum, because this is a thing, I think, give you something to think about. And this is city-states emerge. All of a sudden, maybe last 100 to 200 years, city-states in medieval time, like Venice and Florence, but now become a big nation. And all of a sudden, nation controls cities, and city become bigger since industrial revolution of maybe last 200 years. And all of a sudden, like steel, so like London, if you go to like some medieval city or Toledo or somewhere in Europe, and you feel very comfortable, right? But if you go to big city, we are talking about the big city because you're big city boys and girls, so and that you live your life. So you think this is given, but not really. Many cities of maybe 100 to 200,000 people, which some cities in Aix-Provence are very nice, right? But in Industrial Revolution, almost 200 years, that really begin to change our behavior very radically. That is sort of and expanding our way of communication and transportation, and railway came, and steel, and then all of a sudden steel came into the marketplace, and then structure become bigger and bigger, and 100 years ago, automobile, T-Ford, 1908, even 1905, Einstein discovered E equal MC2. 40 years later, A-bomb. Now, 2 years ago, there's a Fukushima. What are you going to do? And Wright brothers, first flight, 10 seconds, that's 1904. Now you're flying in, just non-stop from London, New York, right? That's the way it is in technology, only 100 years. Now, can we adapt? So you arrived today from London, right? That's great. That's amazing. It doesn't happen 20, 30 years ago. So all of a sudden, computer came, now iPhone. Now then what happened? Baby. iPad came into the marketplace only 3 years ago, so baby are born with iPad. And parents show the photograph and moving thing, and they start touching it, and even you give this girl a book, she just touches thing, not just paging thing. So that's what they do. So they communicate each other, and that's the way it is, and it's going to be much faster and faster. And because of technology, it never stops. So that becomes a singularity. But somehow when you see that, somehow that reminds you of something, of your old time, which many city family may not see. So I think maybe allow you to have a mobilization, and maybe city become more independent, eventually go back to 500 years earlier, because many cities become quite independent. You elect your mayor, and I think you want more mobility, where your talent may be, and this is art. So art become a very important element of life again, and I think always has been a very important element, because artists, poets, performing arts, they are sending some message to us. Look at this thing. Everybody knows, I don't know what it is, but that's give you something, some message for each of you. So that's where museum is, great. But performing art, artists, poets, in Japanese, 働けど働けど、じっと手を見る。
No matter how much a day you work, I still will have to look at the hand.
So that is city, but we are talking about Tokyo, London, New York, big cities. And if you are born in the city, and the wealthy part, and also like poor part, I'm not so sure what kind of life you like to be. And if you have a family, you like to get a little bit outside because you like to have your home, which means home, kate, home, ie, and also te, that means garden, like to have this environment and touching some environment, and the house and garden. That is a unit of home, but I think it's not going to be with high-rise building. So somehow we share that kind of sentiment. We know, our generation knows that kind of past history of art and urban and progress in science and technology, but all of a sudden these children do not know what kind of life they are heading for, because Joichi mentioned this thing, technology always advances. They are born with touch panel, not born digital. So I think what kind of life they are expecting to spend, and the city, more than half of people in the world, expanding world, live in the city. And these cities need some space, identity, and look at what part of your brain you're working on this thing, and that is towards the singularity. It's coming sometime. According to Kurzweil, I think there'll be enough technological advance so that any MOOC and all the things, digital knowledge you have to learn through college will be in the small tip with the advancement of IT technology, nanotechnology, and life sciences, and make a small tip so you put in your brain, everybody has all the digital knowledge. That is coming, according to him, perhaps in 20 years from now, and see what happens. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We would now like to begin the panel discussions. I'd like to ask each members of the panel to come up on the stage. So we listened from 4 individuals. I don't know how I can synthesize them, although I organize this session. Whenever you assume this role of moderator, usually you would assume some kind of story for the session, but I'd like to do some experiment here, do some session without any story in mind. Well, this isn't going to be an experiment. So I'm going to invite each of you to have discussion amongst themselves. I want you to ask each other things that you don't disagree.
Ask one question to someone's statement, which you think it's wrong.
Actually, I was going to by agreeing with one of the other speakers.
You're agreeing.
Is that all right?
Yes, agreeing is easy, but the opposite is more complicated.
Well, no, I'm not sure it is easy. I think, well, it is easy in one sense. I thought that Mr. Ito was saying something very interesting about creativity and its place in education in particular. And I think it is highly relevant to museums. One of the challenges that we have in Britain at the moment is to persuade the government to broaden the national curriculum in education. They have a view about it being very narrow. They want to emphasize the teaching of history, mathematics, English. Essentially, that's it. They want to exclude altogether creativity. And we, as an institution, have been arguing very strongly that creativity, the arts, culture, should be a core part of the curriculum if we're going to build a society which can adapt to the future. And we continue to argue this very strongly, and we believe that museums are one of those places in which that kind of creativity can be developed and experienced. And we think that the lessons that come from the way in which art schools are organized, even more than universities, are lessons that society at large should be engaged in and learn from. But that's not disagreeing. That's agreeing.
Actually, we're going to take over your panel because I have a comment. Because this is a struggle that a lot of people are working on, and we'd love to have the museums with us on this. I think there are a couple of problems. I think that governments and other people with lots of resources like measurements because they like to know when it's been successful or not. The problem is when you try to have education that's measurable, which is testable, you start reducing it to people working by themselves, people working on math and other things that involve knowledge and skills that are testable. And creativity is very difficult to test for. And some of the best things that teachers teach students are things that are not measurable. And as you start to create these things like rating teachers by how well their students do, or rating schools, it all sounds great if you're a planner, but it actually could possibly destroy some of the best elements that we have. And I think that part of culture is very important. And as what's interesting to me about art and the museums that work with it is that somehow you're able to know it when you see it, to be able to say this is good art and this is bad art, or something like that, without a really easily measurable metric. And I think one of the things that confounds educators and other people who are setting these policies is they don't know how to deal with stuff they can't measure, but somehow you figured that out. And so I think that's one piece of the puzzle that needs thinking. And then the other thing is to constantly ask them why. Why? So algebra is very interesting. So they consistently say kids must learn algebra. You can get rid of all, but you have to learn algebra. When you keep asking them why, how useful is algebra, you will eventually get to an academic who will say it's because it teaches kids a basic sort of cognitive way of thinking, and it helps the brain. But then my question is, well, how about teaching them to write computer software? Because it actually challenges the brain in a very similar way, and it's actually much more useful than algebra for the modern kid because they usually have calculators. So the other thing is, I think you need to really have to question where they're teaching those things. But I think what's important is that the traditional academics in education aren't asking those questions in the same way traditionally, and I think others have to kind of get involved in this conversation.
I mean, I think what's interesting about that goes back to your BI-AI division. And while I don't know that I agree with all of the sort of polarities that you were establishing, what is very clear is that the kind of digital platform that we are in the process of creating has changed fundamentally what we need to know. If traditional education required you in a way to have a certain body of knowledge in order to be a sentient human being, what we're learning now is that actually you have access to so much more knowledge than you could ever learn. You have to now know how to manage that knowledge, how to simply source it. And I think what's interesting in that context about creativity is in that it may actually be different today than it was 50 years ago. And where that becomes interesting is that those places in our society that give permission to do things differently, like museums sometimes, to be disobedient, that privilege the unusual over the rote, become ever more important places now, because since everybody basically has access to the same amount of information if you want to use it, it becomes interesting only when you can use that information differently than someone else. And so you need, though, and I guess what I'm arguing is you still need to have places that give us collectively permission to do things in an unusual and different way. And that led me to ask the question, is our brain really changing? Right? Is it being reformatted in some kind of hyper evolutionary way? Or is it simply that our brain is so quickly adaptive that it's just doing what it always does? The output is only different.
And I don't think Sebastian's here, but I think there is some neuroscience that shows that your wiring is changing. Because actually every time you learn something, your brain gets wired differently. And if you reinforce the use of one area, it will actually get bigger. And so, for instance, we talk about multitasking, which is doing a couple of things at once, and most people actually, they're not doing them at once, they're switching between them, and it's very inefficient. But they're showing that some kids now who play certain category of video games can actually multitask. They can think of 3 different things going on at the same time. And so they are developing skills, and there's the simple stuff is the interface, but the more interesting stuff, I think, is for instance, to your point of, if you can get all the information when you need it, you're going to spend a lot less time memorizing the facts, but much more time memorizing the pathways and the ways to ask the questions. And I do think that your point about the difference in the permission, I think the other part is, so on the brain, I do think it's changing. It's the extent to which it's changing, I think, can be argued, but I think there's a lot of data that shows that the cognitive models are different. But to just add to your point, I think that internet was successful because it was a permissionless innovation system where in the old days you had to ask permission before you did anything. But one, because the cost was so low, like no one asked permission to start Facebook or Google or Yahoo because it didn't cost any money and you just connected to the network. And that permissionless innovation is actually what allows the creative people to be empowered. And I think that's an interesting similarity that you described.
To directors from the museum, what do you think that the function of art in the society? As you said, you think that the function is to blur the barrier and make people think more freely, and that's the function, main function of the art.
I don't know that you can actually reduce art to a function, because I think it engages and encompasses so many different possibilities, and I'm very conscious of the fact that the role artistic practices might play in one region could be very different in another region. So just the way in which art is not only made but received changes. But I think what is true largely in major urban environments, and here maybe we can generalize between Tokyo and New York and London and Beijing and Sao Paulo and name any other hyper city that has this, is that art, it acts as a kind of stimulus. It allows for certain kinds of conversations to occur, both in a very intense way among a small group of highly creative people, but also in a much broader way among an interested group of people who may never have the same creative abilities, but who find rewards and benefits from being surrounded by objects that make them think. And so maybe the way to think about art in a creative society is as a catalyst that engages and creates multiple conversations among the networks of people who are involved either as practitioners or beneficiaries of art making.
I mean, I think that the great contribution that art makes is obviously to a certain extent to ask questions and to be undisciplined, to be ill-disciplined, to be prepared to break boundaries. It seems to me, Fumio, that what artists do is to work in territory that they don't even themselves fully comprehend, and to create works in many different media that, as I say, ask questions, provoke us to think in new ways, and break the disciplines that we know and are too familiar with. I mean, when I go in an artist's studio and I see work that has just been made, I'm usually at a loss as to how to respond. And I'm the director of the Tate, and I'm supposed to understand these things. I'm supposed to know everything. If I talk to a person from the press, they always expect that I will be able to give an instant answer as to why a particular work is important that is only made yesterday. I don't have that ability. And the reason I don't have that ability is that good art is always pushing us into places that we've not been before, rather than telling us about the things that we know. I mean, it's one of the things that distinguishes art which we find affecting and different from art which is conventional and too cozy.
I don't know how I can explain this question, but both of the museums are expanding, and also Glenn said that the museum is going out from the wall and then it's going into the city, and it is a good thing. And the art is, as you said, it's something very difficult to define, and you cannot say what is the function is, but also it's, how do you say, to inspire people and make people creative, and make people look at the things in a different way. Okay, then if it goes on and it's spread in the city, if it's more, is it better? Because let me explain. Then in Japan now there are many art festivals in the local cities. Even in Roppongi, we have a Roppongi Art Night. We place a lot of artworks in the city. And then Echigotsumari Triennale and Setouchi Triennale, many big exhibitions are happening, but often they are placed in the town and sometimes agricultural nature. But it's inserting art into the people's life. If it is a good thing, yeah, maybe at the end you don't need a museum.
Well, I mean, I think, and this is really to underscore a point that Nick made. I mean, you can look at the transformation of London since 2000 from a place that wasn't considered a major center for contemporary art to a place that now is one of the most interesting venues in the world, as having been absolutely driven by the work that Nick personally and in particular did, and the success of the Tate Modern. I mean, it's hard to imagine something like Frieze having happened in the absence of what Nick managed to do there. And maybe at some point, one doesn't need museums, but I think the role of a place like the Tate, I hope the role of a place like the Museum of Modern Art, is to foreground all these other activities, in a way to enable them to happen. And if what we do is really successful, there is this constant diaspora of possibilities that get picked up by lots of other people who do things that we could never do. And some of those activities are actually a lot more interesting than what we can do, but they couldn't have happened without the catalytic impact of what's achieved by lots of major institutions. So I just think you can look at what's happened in London as a model of how you can transform the way a city is both perceived broadly, but actually is understood locally, and to do it in very short order. And I think, you know, I think there's a huge difference actually between Bilbao and Tate Modern. Bilbao didn't transform Bilbao into a city of the arts. Tate Modern actually helped catalyze, it wasn't alone, but it helped catalyze London into a major city of the arts. I don't know whether you would, I don't want to put you on the spot, but I really think what you've done, Nick, is extraordinary.
Well, I think, as you say, Glenn, it's, you know, a large number of people and a number of institutions contributed. There's a gentleman sitting in the front row here who was the first director of Tate Modern. He certainly contributed, so it's not personal to that extent. What I do think museums manage to do, perhaps, is that even when art may be everywhere, but then it has a particular resonance when a number of either artists or curators or individuals come together and create some kind of particular insight or give a spark. And while I accept that the only form of teaching is no longer the person standing behind a microphone giving out his personal knowledge, nevertheless, when you bring a group of people together and they interact, something can happen in a given space that can't happen when everyone is separated across the world, not least because those facial expressions make a difference.
Yeah.
Kurokawa-san, he wants to say something.
In a way, I think a human always interact with outside of your own world, right? So that then you respond. And by humans, I think the visual stimuli is the strongest. You know, like dog, that's a sort of smell, right? So human respond. But that may be an intuitive response. So like art, I think not only digital world, it's more digital than digital, but I think that is a sort of place you receive certain message by the artist, but also physical presence. And if you go to, let's say, Hermitage, you can see all the things in the internet, but if you go there, you think you feel something different. Smells, and all of a sudden history, and something like that. Then all of a sudden you have some inquisitive mind. When did this happen? So always you try to ask, but that is the human nature. But all the animals, like they adapt and evolve, but human has some special sort of thing always you want to know more. And all of a sudden knowledge will be given in 20 years, I think, everything almost. But you have to go through some real experience, and then you building your own unique you, which makes you more creative and different. That makes our society much fun.
So internet is not enough.
Right, that's all digital. So
Joe,
I think in a
comment?
way, I think all the sort of writings and other things are digitalizable eventually. But real experience is not. And facial expression, dialogue, and this is with face and everything is real experience. And you learn something from here, and not the digital thing.
I think that there's a parallel between science and art in that what the internet has done is lowered the cost of trying things, so you don't have to learn as much craft and skills to express yourself in many arts and with many sciences. And also we're connecting people together. So I think the role of the university and the role of the museum are somewhat similar because we give permission and we give support to those eccentric creative people and we convene. But what's interesting in a university now is sometimes you start to find really odd places where people are doing very interesting things and people invent things at very low costs. And in a similar way, I think you will start to find artists popping up in places that aren't traditional. And I mean, they've always had that, but it's more common. And then you can create a network like you're doing online with your website. So the way that I like to explain it is the Media Lab it was a container that had an extremely highly creative process inside. But now we're trying to turn it into a platform. So you still need the brand and the convening and the people who set the culture. But you can now start to interoperate with other networks and collect people and amplify out and also get more interesting people in. So I think it's an and. And I think you do have to change the model a little bit, but I think the physical space, I mean, I agree with everyone. You have to have that. And if you look at all the communities that are successful on the internet, there always is some sort of platform that pulls them. It's a brand, it's sometimes anime content that create fan fiction, or it's a music, or it's a game, but there's something very highly controlled in the middle that allows this kind of internet-like creativity to flourish around it, I think.
Nixon.
I mean, I do think that the way in which museums communicate, the way in which museums operate within themselves is changing very fast. Only 10 years ago, virtually every text, even to the smallest text or label next to a work of art, would have to have been overseen by a chief curator who would not allow the word of the museum to go out without checking it, him or herself. And now we have to work in a world where most of our curators have their own personal blog. They are communicating both on behalf of themselves and on behalf of the institution. And we have to learn ways of managing that whole process without giving up responsibility. Because there is nevertheless, as an institution, there is a responsibility to have a position in the world and to identify what that position is without necessarily insisting that every curator within the institution also adopts the same position.
It's that funny tension between authority and permission, isn't it? Yeah. That we expect our institutions to speak with an authoritative voice, but we actually want them to be open and empathetic and places that allow us to participate. And I actually think the biggest change, and it relates to the whole idea of the evolving city that I see in major museums is the notion of the institutions becoming participatory, that they actually seeking both works of art that enable a larger public to participate with them, but also spaces and experiences that allow for people to feel embedded in the central activity of the institution. And I think it's about extending what we do among friends to something that we can do within both the physical and metaphoric walls of the institution. And this idea of the museum as a participatory space rather than a passive space, I think is changing how we see the institution and breaking down some of the more traditional notions of responsibility and authority, because in fact, when we're at our best, we're kind of crowdsourcing in a very particular way, but I think that's what we're really doing. And for people who were brought up with the idea of curatorial authority and responsibility, this is a frightening space to be in, because it challenges that, and yet at the same time, of course, you need that knowledge to spark the conversation.
But I think it's very interesting because the expansion of the human population and middle class is emerging, and there will be many, many cities like say China and India which embrace maybe 500,000 to 1 million, and I'm sure they are very smart and thinking about some modeling of this thing, not from medieval age. All of a sudden they build a big one, and I'm sure they're going to build a park and also museum, and like Qatar, Doha, and Abu Dhabi, this Louvre, all the things. And how it functions. It's quite different from Tokyo and London and New York. So I think that would be a big experiment, but it's going on all the time. And I think that is a great challenge for human being to have this new century, because time goes pretty fast. But they'll be built. Once it's built, it's very difficult to destroy for some time. And if you're like Tate, you have to maneuver all the things, right? So that is a big challenge, but that is an experiment.
Just 2 days ago, there was a question posed to the whole audience that which do you think more important for development of the city? The leadership or freedom? Leadership or freedom? But leadership is sometimes a control, you know.
I would say freedom is sometimes an illusion.
But also another thing is mobility. I think if you, like talent mobility, I think they could move very freely across the national border. So I think more than half and maybe 60% live in the city, and many would be attracted to certain cities and new emerging city because they offer something for your talent.
You know, but cities are fragile. I mean, because I think, and so I think leadership should not be ignored. We have a lot of examples of cities where the leadership has gone astray and the cities have really suffered. You only need to look at a place like Detroit in the United States, which is an exaggerated example of that. But you can name many other places where a change in leadership has resulted actually in a deterioration of the city, and other places where new leadership has provided energy and vision. So I don't know that they have to always be appositional, leadership and freedom, but I do think cities need an awful lot of commitment, civic commitment, to thrive. And when that civic commitment is lost, they can fall apart very quickly.
Museum is the same?
Definitely.
Nick-san?
No, I was simply going to say that we've been talking about many different kinds of cities, and of course, I'm very conscious that when Glenn talks about London becoming a creative centre, he's talking about a small element within the centre of London. And paradoxically, of course, most of the artists are being pushed out from the centre, away from a place of easy communication, simply by the economic forces which push rents and other costs of living in the centre of London higher and higher. And when we talk about a city like Tokyo, it takes me not simply because of the traffic, but it takes me an hour to drive from the edge to the center. There are huge parts of these cities that remain untouched by the institutions that we represent. And communication with people in those places is a very important part of the future of the institution, and that's a place where the internet can play a part.
One of the answers to that question by Mr. Mori was this building, maybe.
Understood.
Joy, any comment?
Yeah, I guess I would just add that I don't want to overemphasize this, but I do want to emphasize the similarity of science and art and institutions that protect both. And in Boston, I'm very jealous of the art in New York. I think some of the New York universities are jealous of our Nobel Prizes. But I think that sort of collaborating, so our degree program is called Media, Arts, and Sciences. And I think more and more, I think we should start to try to create programs that, because I think artists dabble in technology right now, but they don't go heavy into technology. And similarly, a lot of scientists are interested in art, but they don't go heavy into art. And I think that really seriously doing those things together can help both sides.
Now we're exceeding the time, so of course for this kind of discussion there is no conclusion, but I hope that you could become able to see the things, the issue from many different point of views, and we will continue to have this kind of discussion in the future. Thank you very much.
ありがとうございました。グレン・ラウリーさん、ニコラス・セル。
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank everyone for their contribution in this session.